Good evening. Hi. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I think most of you know who I am, but I am Lizzie Cooper. I work here in help with our Hispanic ministry called El Cuerpo. I am the associate director, and we are super excited to have Matt Soerens here from World Relief. Matt came on with World Relief as an intern in Nicaragua. He now serves as their Vice President of Advocacy and has co-authored several books. So Cora and I had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. with World Relief recently. And World Relief focuses on advocacy for immigrants and refugees. And you'll hear much more about what they're about. But we are super excited to welcome him. He is coming from Illinois, so he came a long way, has 4 kids, and his oldest daughter is with him. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me, Lizzie. It's wonderful to be with you. And it's been fun to spend the day in Wilmington with my daughter. So I do work in an organization called World Relief, which, if you're not familiar with World Relief, we are the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. We were started about 80 years ago in response to a displacement crisis. In the days after World War II, when there were churches in the United States that wanted to come alongside churches in Europe and help to rebuild after the effects of the war, and when people had been displaced across the continent. And in time, what was the National Association of Evangelicals War Relief Commission became the World Relief Commission and expanded beyond that one country, that one part of the world to, at this point, we've been active in more than 100 countries in the last 80 years. Including here in the United States, where since the 1970s, we've been involved in resettling refugees and providing services to other immigrants. One thing that is really unique about World Relief, though, is our mission, which is not just to resettle refugees or help immigrants integrate into communities, though we want to do those things really well, but our mission is to equip and empower local churches to care for those who are experiencing vulnerability. And so if we've resettled refugees, which we've done about 300,000, we've resettled about 300,000 individuals over the last 40 plus years around the country. But if we do that without working closely with local churches, we've actually missed our mission. So it's really vital to us that we're working in close partnership with local churches. We don't necessarily care that a family remembers that they were served by World Relief. We want them to remember that they were served by a local church, whether that's in Burundi or in Ukraine or in North Carolina. We don't have an office here in Wilmington, unfortunately. There are similar organizations in Wilmington, like Church World Service, that do refugee resettlement. Our closest office is over in Durham. But I also don't have to tell any of you that this mission of coming alongside churches to welcome refugees and other immigrants could actually be a little bit controversial right now. We're entering into an election season, and probably every 4 years we find that this becomes even more controversial, that issues of immigration tend to be viewed from a political perspective, or maybe an economic perspective, a security perspective. And all those things are very much valid and important. But what's really important to us at World Relief is that we really shift the conversation to start with a biblical perspective, that we think about this issue as something that the scriptures speak to. And we know from both anecdotal experience and from research that we can't necessarily presume that that's where every Christian starts their thinking on this topic. In fact, we did a survey about a year ago with Lifeway Research, and it's a Christian polling firm, and they asked self-identified evangelical Christians across the United States, what's the most important factor that influences your views on the arrival of immigrants to your community? And the nice folks at Lifeway told us up front that if you give evangelical Christians any question, and one of the choices is the Bible, they sort of know that's the right answer. They know that that's the box they're supposed to check. Whether or not that's totally true, they know that that's what should be informing their views. And yet, even with that dynamic at play, only about 1 in 5 evangelical Christians said that the Bible was the most important factor influencing their views on the arrival of immigrants to their community. Far less than said the media. So for a lot of us, we've thought about this issue from the perspective of Fox News or CNN or a local newspaper or social media, which are all fine. But sometimes we've done so and we haven't realized that the Bible actually has a lot to say to this issue as well. So that's what I want to do this evening in 40, 45 minutes or so, just walk through some of the major themes scripturally that we think ought to be informing how those of us who are followers of Jesus would think about this complex issue. And I'll start with this reality, that for those of us who are followers of Jesus, we are followers of a refugee, or maybe an asylum seeker. We can discuss the legal formalities there in a moment. But the picture you see up there is actually my daughter Zipporah, who's here with me tonight, somewhere in the kids' ministry. This was several years ago. We, as we will probably do in the next few weeks, around Thanksgiving, we pull out our nativity scene out of our basement. And for the whole month of December, this just became Zippy's favorite toy when she was probably 3 or 4 years old. And we had read her the storybook Bible enough that she knew how to act out the story. Joseph and Mary going down from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and then there's no room at the inn, and there's some cute animals in a stable, and then there's shepherds and wise men. But Zippy turned to me one day and said, "Dad, this toy is missing someone. We don't have the angry king." And I thought about that. Do any of you have a nativity set with the King Herod figurine? I've yet to see that. It's maybe not our favorite part of that story. In fact, it's much more pleasant to end our nativity pageants with the wise men, the magi, bowing down before Jesus with their gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then we can all go home and have a nice Christmas dinner and maybe exchange some presents, because even Jesus got presents. It's a lot less pleasant to keep reading the story in Matthew chapter 2. Because as soon as the magi, the wise men, are on their way back to their country, Joseph is warned in a dream that Herod, this paranoid, tyrannical, angry king, is coming to kill all the little boys in Bethlehem. And Joseph is warned to get up in the middle of the night, to take Mary and Jesus, and to escape across the border into Egypt, outside of Herod's domain, where they would be safe. And in that sense, I think it's fair to describe Jesus as a refugee. Of course, they didn't have formal legal definitions at that time. We do have those formal legal definitions now. Under both U.S. law and international law, a refugee is someone who has fled a well-founded fear of persecution, left their country. That persecution must be on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or membership in a particular social group. And just by that definition, the best estimates right now is that there's about 35 million refugees in our world today, which is many, many times more even than it was when I started working at World Relief about less than 20 years ago. We've seen just a dramatic increase on a global level of the amount of forced displacement across borders. Now, if you think about that definition, you only become a refugee when you've fled your country. So you have another 60 million or so who are displaced within the boundaries of their country. All in all, you're looking at this point, more than 100 million people around our world who've been forcibly displaced. The other category that fits into that 100 million is asylum seekers. The easiest way to understand the distinction between refugees and asylum seekers, a refugee, at least in the eyes of the U.S. government, is someone who is outside of their country of origin, but they're also outside of our country. And we have identified them overseas, and a very small share of the world's refugees each year get flown to the United States at the invitation of the U.S. government. Last year it was about 60,000. So you can do the math on 60,000 out of 35 million. It's a very small share of 1%. Asylum seekers are people who weren't necessarily invited to the United States. They made their own way here, whether reaching a border or coming on a temporary visa and arriving at an airport. And once here, they say, "Please don't send me back because I have a well-founded fear of persecution for one of these reasons." And U.S. law says that if you can prove that with documentary evidence, you're allowed to stay and you're treated like a refugee. If you cannot prove that, in general, you'd be deported back to a country of origin. And in the interim, while we wait for a judge to be able to hear your case, you're considered an asylum seeker, kind of a limbo status, waiting for a determination on whether you qualify or not. Now, again, I don't know which of those categories necessarily Jesus would fit into. We don't get a lot of details about their journey in Matthew chapter 2. We don't know how they were treated when they got to Egypt. We don't know if they interacted with Egyptian governing authorities at all. But what we do know is that for those roughly 100 million people today who've been forced to flee their homes, they have someone in Jesus who can very personally identify with that experience. And our belief at World Relief is that certainly ought to inform how those of us who follow Jesus today would respond to people in a similar circumstance. Another really core biblical theme is that, we see throughout in the beginning of the Bible that God has created every human person in his image. And Christians have historically understood this to mean that human life is precious. That regardless of any qualifier, if you are a human person, your life has value. It's worth protecting, regardless of your country of origin, your religion, whether you're born or unborn, your nationality, your religion, any factor. If you're a human person, your life is valuable. And that, of course, would give us a motivation when someone is fleeing a threat of persecution or even of death to do whatever we reasonably could to protect that life. But then there's another dynamic to this idea of the imago Dei, of being made in the image of God, that I think is relevant as we think about issues of refugees and migration. And that is that we believe that every human person has been made in the image of a creator, with that potential to create, to contribute. And that's true of all people, not just immigrants, but it is true of immigrants. And I think that's a reality that sometimes gets forgotten, because very often when we think about these issues of immigration, we tend to go quickly to, well, what is this going to cost us? What are those people going to take? How many jobs will they take? Those are fair questions, and the sort of questions that a good economist can analyze. But actually, a good economist doesn't do a cost analysis. They do a cost-benefit analysis. And we make a mistake if we only look at one side of that ledger and forget that because these are people made in God's image, they have the potential to contribute as well. So it's fair to ask, well, how many jobs will these refugees take or these immigrants take? But only if we're concurrently asking the question, how many jobs will they create? And historically, the answer is probably a lot. If you look at it throughout American history, about 45% of Fortune 500 companies in this country were founded or co-founded by an immigrant or their child. Tens of millions of American jobs wouldn't exist, or at least wouldn't exist in this country, if it wasn't for our country's legacy of immigration. Or at a fiscal level, it's of course true that there are some costs borne by taxpayers associated with immigrants' presence in the country. So if you look specifically at refugees, this is a relatively small subset of immigrants who were invited by the US government because they had met this definition, having fled persecution. They actually get some assistance that most other immigrants do not qualify for. They get enough funding that usually covers their first 2 to 3 months of rent while they're in the country. And they do qualify for some public benefits while their income levels are low enough as well. And it's true, if you looked at the average refugee, let's say 3 years after arrival, in the vast majority of cases, at that point, they would have received more from the American taxpayer than they had paid in taxes. The same is true of my 3-year-old son, Zacchaeus. He's a total drain on the economy. He's recently potty trained, so he's making some progress, but not paying taxes yet. But that's a little bit silly, right? We don't really look at someone at one snapshot in time. You would look over a horizon of time. And it turns out with resettled refugees, the same is true. The economists who've looked at this at Notre Dame have said that it's usually around year 8 or 9 that the average refugee goes from receiving more than they're paying in to actually paying in more than they're receiving. And by year 20, on average, the average refugee adult has contributed $21,000 more in taxes at all levels, local, state, and federal, than the combined cost of governmental expenditures on their behalf. If you zoom out and look at immigrants more generally, even those who are not lawfully present, which is a different category of immigrants than refugees, most economists think that there's a similar story. There are absolutely some costs, but the contributions actually outweigh the costs on an economic level. And now, to be really clear, at World Relief, we don't resettle refugees or serve immigrants primarily because we think it's in our economic interest to do so. We do so because we think that these lives are worth protecting, that their dignity is worth affirming. And yet it is precisely because these are people made in the image of a creator God that we shouldn't be surprised that they have something to contribute as well, both economically and otherwise. Another really core biblical theme that guides our work is this principle we see, especially in the Old Testament, but into the New as well, that God has a particular concern for those who are vulnerable. And in the Old Testament especially, we often see 3 groups of people mentioned in the same passages. It's the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. Or depending upon which Bible translation you're reading in English, you might see sojourner, stranger, alien, immigrant. The Hebrew word there is the word ger, and it appears 92 times in the Old Testament. It's actually a very frequent theme. Sometimes just descriptively, describing someone who's gone from one country to another, but often prescriptively, with God telling the people of Israel, these are people whom I love and whom you are to love as well. It's a fairly close paraphrase of Deuteronomy 10, 17 through 19. And not only does God give that generic instruction to love, he also provided a set of laws for the people of Israel with a particular concern for these vulnerable categories of people. So for example, in Deuteronomy 24, God tells the Israelites, when you go through your crops, your olives, your wheat, your grapes, you should go through everything one time and leave what remains for the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. Which, if you think about it, was actually a really ingenious system. It wasn't a handout system. There was still some work to be done, and I think that affirms the dignity of the work to be done. But it was also recognizing this reality that in an agrarian society where your ability to feed yourself was tied to the land, these were categories of people who were not likely to be landowners. And yet God was concerned for their well-being and set up a system to ensure that they could access their most basic need for food. You can go forward with that into the Psalms, into the books of the prophets, and you see some of those same themes where God mentions the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner, and actually in some cases God judging the people of Israel for failing to follow the rules of protecting those categories of people who are vulnerable. I should also say, I'm not taking those Old Testament passages and saying what we really need is to call the U.S. Congress and tell them to put in place a gleaning law where you can't go through your fields twice. For two reasons. One, I don't think that would solve all of our immigration challenges. And two, those were laws that God gave to a specific group of people. He wasn't speaking to the United States of America in those contexts. And yet, that also doesn't mean that these passages are irrelevant to us. Because if you go back to Deuteronomy 10, the foundational reason that God tells his people to love those who are foreigners was rooted in his own character. God says that I love these people, and so you shall love them as well. And God's character doesn't change. Another really core biblical principle, and we find this in the Old Testament and then it carries into the New Testament, is the command to love our neighbors as ourselves. And we see that in its first instance in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. A few verses later in Leviticus 19, 33 and 34, God tells the people of Israel, "When foreigners reside with you in your land, you shall not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you shall be to you as your native born. You shall love them as yourselves, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt." Thank you. So if we just had that one chapter in Leviticus 19 to work from, we could conclude that command to love has broad ramifications. But Jesus makes that even more clear in the Gospels when he's asked, well, what's the greatest commandment? And most of us can recall what he said. He affirmed it's to love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. But the legal scholar who's asking him questions in Luke chapter 10, he tells us in the text that he wants to justify himself. So he's got a follow-up question. Who is my neighbor? And presumably he would like a very precise legal definition so that he can demonstrate that he has met that requirement. Well, my neighbor is someone 3 doors down on either side as long as they're of the same language, ethnicity, and religion as me. But that's not the response that Jesus gives. Instead, he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. Most of us know that story quite well. There's this presumably Jewish person beaten, robbed, and left to die on the side of the road to Jericho. Along comes a priest and a Levite, the religious leaders of the time, but they pass by on the other side. And then a Samaritan, someone who was of a different religion, a different ethnicity, not just different, but actually despised by most people, most Jewish people at that time, comes along, sees him in need, has compassion on him, and takes him to get help. And one obvious takeaway for us from that is that whoever our neighbor is today, it probably has to include a vulnerable stranger or traveler of a different ethnicity or religion, because that's the example that Jesus gave us. Another observation on that story as it relates to our situation is that Jesus doesn't say, love your neighbor as yourself so long as it's completely safe. There's no caveat to that command. In fact, if you think about the story, the Samaritan in the story who stops and gets off of his donkey on the side of this road that scholars tell us actually had kind of a bad reputation. It was a sort of road you didn't want to be on late at night because people would be beaten and robbed and left to die. That might be why the priest and the Levite, or one of the reasons that the priest and the Levite did walk by on the other side. They were just being prudent from a human perspective. And yet the hero of the story, our model of neighborly love, is the person who puts himself at a little bit of risk to get off and help this person who's in need. And I read that story, it reminds me of some of the churches that World Relief has partnered with over the years in the Middle East and parts of Africa, who are caring for really large numbers of people who've recently crossed a border into their country. And they're doing so not because they're naive, and it hasn't occurred to them that there could be some risk involved. They're doing so because, frankly, it never occurred to them that following Jesus was going to be safe. And that really challenges me, because I'm an American, and safety is a very high cultural value for Americans. I noticed this one day, even without thinking. I closed my emails with statements like, take care, be safe, which are very nice sentiments, nothing wrong with that, but not necessarily biblical mandates. The biblical mandate is take courage, be not afraid. And not because we live in a great, powerful country that can protect us, though pretty much we do, but because we have a great and powerful God in whose hands we are, at least eternally, completely secure. Now here's the irony in all that. We would be called to love our neighbors even if it was risky. In our context, in the United States of America, in North Carolina, the risk is actually very, very slim. So for example, if we look at refugees in particular, again, these are individuals who have been invited by the US government to come to our country. They're invited only after going a very thorough vetting process. In fact, groups from across the political spectrum, from the left to the right, the Heritage Foundation more on the conservative side, have looked at this vetting process and concluded this is the most thorough vetting that our country has for any category of visitor or immigrant who enters into the United States. We have millions and millions of people enter the United States each year, most of them tourists, coming to go shopping or go to Disney World. They all get a little bit of vetting when they're entering lawfully, but refugees, who are a much smaller share of those who are entering, go through a much more thorough vetting process. It can actually take a year or two to complete, and it involves multiple layers of background checks and health exams and in-person interviews to verify that they meet that legal definition of a refugee, and it's been remarkably effective. In the last several years in particular, I think there's been understandably lots of appropriate questions of how, are we sure that this vetting is adequate, especially with some of the going back to 2015, 2016, there was a lot of concerns around the Syrian refugee resettlement process. Could there be an Islamist terrorist attack in the United States? The reality is that vetting process has served us quite well. Since the Refugee Act of 1980 was signed into law, we've had about 3 million refugees resettled to the United States since that time. And not a single American life has been lost in an Islamist terror attack perpetrated by someone who came through that refugee vetting process. Now, that's not to say that could never happen, or that we shouldn't expect our government to do their job to vet people. It is to say they've done a fairly good job, and my concern is sometimes that as the church, we've been so focused on the question of, well, is this safe? Or maybe, is the government doing its job, but then not looking too hard for the answers, that we forgot to ask the question that was asked of Jesus, which is, who is my neighbor? And if it's a family showing up at the airport, to be there to welcome them and to walk alongside them and to help them to adjust to life in a new country. Of course, it would be fair of you to look at that data point and say, okay, well, you just chose the most thoroughly vetted category of immigrant to say this is safe, but that's not all immigrants. What about, on the other end of that spectrum, an immigrant who wasn't vetted at all, who successfully kind of snuck across the border? Isn't that a concern? And our view at World Relief has always been that we should have secure borders. That is to say, it's our government's responsibility to know who's coming into the country, to do whatever is reasonably possible to keep out anyone who'd be seeking to do harm. I think that's an appropriate expectation on government, and one that they don't adequately do. They have made some improvements, and that's worth acknowledging, but there's still work to be done in that regard. That said, it's not fair to presume that those who are here unlawfully, so then we're talking a separate category of people from refugees, it's not fair to presume that those who are here unlawfully are disproportionately a threat to public safety. And I say that because there's probably about 11 million of those people by the estimates of the Department of Homeland Security. They say that most of those people have been here for at least 10 years, meaning if their plan was to commit crime, they've had adequate time to do so. And most of them have not. A very few of them have, of course, and that becomes a headline issue when they do. But actually, we have really good data that suggests that those immigrants who are unlawfully present commit crime per capita at a significantly lower rate than native-born U.S. citizens. The best data point for that, and I know you won't be able to read this perfectly, we can send you the slides, by the way, if you'd like to go read this study. I'd encourage you to do so. But this is from Texas, not because I forgot to change this when I did an event in Texas 2 weeks ago. But Texas happens to be the only state out of 50 that tracks the immigration legal status of felony convictions. And what you notice in this slide, whether you look over time, over the last decade or so, or you're looking at different categories of crime, violent crime, property crime, drug crime, the blue line on top is my category. It's native-born U.S. citizens. The next is lawfully present immigrants. That would include anyone resettled as a refugee in red. And in green, you have undocumented immigrants, those who are unlawfully present. And what you'll notice is native-born U.S. citizens are, in pretty much all of those categories, have the highest rates of crime per capita. Now, I'm not telling you that so that you'll be afraid of your U.S. citizen neighbors. Just to say that it's not particularly rational to be uniquely afraid of your foreign-born neighbors, whether you think that they're here lawfully or not. I'm also not trying to make the argument here that this is because citizens are morally inferior to immigrants. What I think is actually at play here is consequences. If you're a citizen and you commit certain crimes, you deal with the U.S. criminal justice system, or your state's criminal justice system. If you're an immigrant, you deal with that same criminal justice system, and then you get turned over to the immigration legal system, where even a relatively minor criminal offense in certain states could be a deportable offense. So if you steal a candy bar in certain states with a green card, you're here lawfully, that is a crime involving moral turpitude under some states' laws and could be a reason to be deported. So you have a pretty strong disincentive to criminal behavior, which is a good thing. We don't want people committing crime. Where it can be challenging is we have really good evidence that immigrants commit crime at disproportionately low rates. There's also some evidence that immigrants are victims of crime at higher rates than others. And that probably is because they tend to be wary of calling the police when they're victims of crime or when they're witnesses to crime, whether for cultural reasons or legal status reasons or just linguistic barriers. Another sort of security concern that I think is worth raising is around drugs. And this relates again to the border. So we're not talking about refugees who come through the airport, but this would be a dynamic around the US-Mexico border. Most of us are aware that we've had a very sharp and really awful increase in deaths related to fentanyl in particular in the last several years. And it is true that most fentanyl comes from, or at least through, Mexico. What's not true is that it comes with people crossing the border unlawfully, or with people seeking asylum. At least in the vast majority of cases, about 90% of cases, the fentanyl is crossing at lawful ports of entry. That is to say, where you drive your car up and show your passport and say, here I am coming back to the United States. Often in trucks, sometimes in passenger vehicles. And in 90% of the convictions are for drug trafficking, of fentanyl in particular, are of US citizens. Again, that's not because US citizens are necessarily inferior, it's because the drug cartels, which are evil but also very smart, huge businesses, are not dumb. And they're not going to put their very valuable product in the backpack of someone who is, in most cases, looking to be apprehended to seek asylum. Or even someone who's trying to sneak across the border and evade Border Patrol. Since most of the time they're caught, that's not a very good strategy. Whereas there are so many individuals who are crossing lawfully for good reasons at the ports of entry that's where they put most of their drugs, because it's a very, very small share that could have drugs, and it's very difficult to catch. Now, I don't have a solution to that, except for to say we could build a wall 1,000 feet high and stop asylum altogether, and it would maybe reduce fentanyl trafficking by 10%, but it wouldn't resolve the larger problem. All of that is to say, we would be called to love our neighbors, even if there was some risk involved. Most of the time, the risks that we presume that there might be are a lot less than we might hear in media sometimes. But that does also bring up another complicated issue for Christians to shift the conversation from refugees who were invited into the United States, thoroughly vetted overseas, to what about someone who's here unlawfully? That's, I think, a harder question for a lot of Christians, because on the one hand, we want to love and welcome people. We want to share the gospel with people. We'll get to that. But we also want to follow the law. And there's biblical reasons for that as well. Probably the most prominent would be in Romans chapter 13, where the Apostle Paul says that everyone should be subject to the governing authorities. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So, should we love and welcome people, or should we follow the law? I'm pretty sure the answer is both. At least in most cases, there's not the dilemma that we might presume there is. The good news for those of us who happen to be US citizens is that there's actually nothing in our laws that would prevent a church from caring for people, even if you suspect that some of them may not be here lawfully. There's nothing in the law that would say you can't run an English class or a tutoring program or a food pantry, or that you can't share the gospel with someone or baptize them or teach them Sunday school, or let them teach Sunday school to you, which might be just as likely. As long as you're not compensating them. That is actually where the law gets more complicated, is in terms of employment. But in terms of the sort of ministry that a normal individual US citizen or a church or a nonprofit organization would engage with their immigrant neighbors, whether they know that they're here lawfully or not, they're not violating the law by offering those services. Now, this is harder for our sisters and brothers in Christ who are themselves undocumented, who are not here lawfully, whether they cross the border unlawfully, which is about half of those 11 million people, or they overstayed a temporary visa, which is roughly the other half. Many of them are also believers. And many of them have also read Romans chapter 13. I've met, I go to a Spanish-speaking church where this affects a lot of the people that I worship with. And frankly, I've met people who are really anguished by this dynamic, because they know that they're called to be subject to the governing authorities. And their first response to that is, can I fix this? I came into the country, in many cases it was 20, 30 years ago, unlawfully. Is there a way to make this right? And when they ask me that, I send them to my colleagues who are legal counselors or attorneys, and they can assess that situation. And occasionally there is. But the large majority of the people in that circumstance, the answer is no. There's nothing you can do to fix this. There's no amount of money that you can pay. Nice, well-meaning people will tell you to go back and come the legal way. But there's actually no legal way for you to come back. Not in 1 year, not in 5 years, not in 10 years. And that's a complicated thing when you've got several children who are born here who are US citizens. It goes to the reality that they were probably ineligible to come lawfully in the first place. In fact, most of them would have much preferred to have come lawfully, but that wasn't an option to them. And that comes to how our legal system works, which, to simplify a very complicated legal system, basically there's 4 ways to come lawfully as an immigrant to the United States. You can have a family sponsor who's a US citizen, or in a more narrow set of relationships, a lawful permanent resident. So a spouse, parent, sibling, child. Not your grandparents, not your cousins, not extended family. Some of those petitions move quickly, like 6 months to a year for a spouse of a US citizen. Some of them take a very long time, like 20 to 25 years for an adult child in certain cases, or a sibling of a US citizen. But the next possibility, if you don't have a family member, is employer sponsorship. That means you've got a company in the United States who has a specific role open and they can't find a qualified US citizen or other lawfully present immigrant. They can petition for a specific individual. There's 140,000 employer-sponsored immigrant visas available each year under the law. But of those, only 5,000 can possibly go to someone who isn't classified as highly skilled. So it's not easy if you're coming with a master's degree to come and do an IT job. It's still a very competitive process. But if you're coming to do agricultural work, or to work in the back of a restaurant, or to care for someone's children, your chance of getting an employer-sponsored immigrant visa are basically zero. There are some temporary work programs for those categories, and for some people those work really well. For others, that's all that's available to them, so they come on a temporary basis and they overstay and join that 11 million people who are unlawfully present. A third possibility is the diversity visa lottery. This is an online lottery. The odds of winning most years are about 1 in 300 to 1 in 500, depending on how many people enter, which is better than one of those scratch-off games at the gas station, but not very good odds. And you can't enter if you're from Mexico, or El Salvador, Guatemala, India, South Korea, China, any of the countries that send the most immigrants to the United States already. And the last possibility is refugee or asylum status. So those are related because you're proving the same thing. Again, to be a refugee, to get resettled, your odds are pretty slim because there's 35 million refugees in the world. And even in like a high year, the US might resettle 100,000. Recently, it's been a lot less than that. And asylum is part of the dynamic and the challenge we see at the border right now, because it's sort of the last option out of these to try to come lawfully, but it requires you to get to the border. And some people qualify, many others frankly don't qualify. They may be fleeing poverty, but that doesn't qualify you for asylum. And there's also a lot of people who frankly don't know if they qualify because they don't have complex understandings of US immigration law. And even if they did, I have a pretty complex understanding of US immigration law. I was in a shelter on the border last Friday in Tijuana, and I talked to people and I couldn't tell them if they qualified or not. I could tell them that they had a stronger case or a weaker case, but it's going to depend on how much evidence they have and frankly which judge they get assigned to, because it can be a very subjective determination. All that to say, I would love to tell my friends who are in this circumstance, you know, you broke the law, so you need to go fix that. Here's the fine to pay. Here's the process to go through. That's actually what we advocated for as a policy at World Relief, because that doesn't exist right now. But what we've said for a long time, going back to 2006 when President Bush was proposing this, is there ought to be a broad reform for immigration laws. It should be harder to immigrate illegally. We should have secure borders. It should be easier to immigrate legally, and not without limit, but right now, for example, we have several million more jobs in this national economy than we have people who say they're looking for work. That would be a good time to have more work-based visas and make it easier for families to be reunited more quickly. And then the hardest thing is perhaps, what do you do with people who are already here, who've been living here a long time? And what we've said is we shouldn't just do an amnesty that says you broke the law, but it's forgiven and forgotten, here's your citizenship. Nor should we deport everyone, because that's just both logistically and on a humanitarian level very, very difficult, especially when you consider the millions of children who are born here, who are US citizens under the 14th Amendment. What we've said is there ought to be a way for people to come forward, pay a fine as a penalty for having violated the law, and then have the chance to earn permanent legal status if they'd be willing to meet certain qualifications. There's a bipartisan bill in the House right now that would do roughly those things, has a $5,000 fine attached to it, that those who entered before they were adults would be exempt from, so there'd be some differentiation for those who were brought as children. We've supported that at World Relief. We think it's a good faith process because it would also do $35 billion more for border security, which we actually think is actually needed right now. Unfortunately, I would be lying if I told you I thought that was anywhere near passing, but it has been introduced and has sponsors on both sides of the aisle. Okay, a few more points. One is that most of us are familiar with some kind of depressing line graphs of the church on the decline in the United States. If you look at church attendance in the United States among evangelicals, if you look at mainline Protestants or the Catholic Church, kind of similar trends, fewer and fewer people are in church. The exception to that is actually among immigrant congregations, where we see growth in various parts of the United States. And that actually presents this idea that maybe this dynamic that we've often been presented as a problem could actually be something that God is doing to bring revival to the United States. This quote is really compelling from Tim Tennant, who's the seminary, he's a missiologist and the president of Asbury Seminary in Kentucky. He says 86% of the immigrant population in North America are likely to either be Christians or become Christians. It's far above the national average. The immigrant population actually presents the greatest hope for Christian renewal in North America. We shouldn't see this as something that threatens us. We should see this as a wonderful opportunity. For example, if you look at refugee resettlement, the top country of origin for refugee resettlement over the last 2 decades is Burma, also known as Myanmar in Southeast Asia. Primarily Buddhist country with a very repressive military regime that does not tolerate religious freedom or religious minorities. And that's why about 70% of the Burmese refugees resettled to the US have been Christians, largely Baptists. In fact, my Baptist Karen Burmese friends, they celebrate Adoniram Judson Day every year. It's the missionary who brought the gospel to their people group in Burma. In fact, I had a Karen Burmese Baptist church that met in the apartment just underneath mine for a number of years. I would know that church was happening because there would be about 30 sets of shoes outside of the apartment and really loud worship music. And I've had some of those brothers and sisters at my door to make sure I know who Jesus is. And though I've been a Christian basically my whole life, I have had a lot to learn about following Jesus from those brothers and sisters who were persecuted for their faith, driven out of their country into refugee camps for a decade or longer before coming to the United States. And when they got to the United States, I had one friend tell me, we thought the United States, this is the country that says in God we trust on your money. We thought everyone here was a Christian. And then we showed up and some of your churches were kind of empty and only older people. And we realized that maybe God had a purpose in sending us here, so sure, to protect our lives, but also to bring the gospel back to the United States. And not just from Burma, but in a number of contexts, we see that happening. As we welcome those people, it's also true that we have an opportunity to welcome Jesus himself. Because Jesus said in Matthew 25, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And the disciples say, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or sick or in prison or a stranger? And Jesus said, whatever you did for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it unto me. It's also important to know that when the U.S. steps back from refugee resettlement, which we did beginning in 2017 for a number of years, that has a profound impact on the persecuted church. Just a month or so ago, actually, Lizzie and Socorro were with us in DC when we released this report with Open Doors US. We did an analysis of the number of Christian refugees of any Christian background from the 50 countries where Open Doors US says that Christians are facing the most severe persecution in the world. So Burma is high on that list, Afghanistan, North Korea, Syria, Iraq, Iran, other countries you would probably expect on that list. I don't know if you can read that, but it went from, in 2016, the number of Christian refugees from those 50 countries was about 32,000. It bottomed out just over 5,000, about a 90% decline in 2020. And by 2022, it was up to 9,500. So right now, we're about 70% below what we were in 2016. We do hope that will continue to rise. It is an upward trend, but that could also go back down. And it is largely, the graph there looks pretty similar to the number of refugees admitted overall, because over the last number of years, about half the refugees admitted to the United States have been Christians, and many of them coming specifically because of their faith in Christ. Of course, the flip side of the reality that a lot of refugees are Christians is a lot of other refugees are not Christians. The minority perhaps, but still a significant number. And for a lot of American Christians, that's actually the larger concern. If it was all the Burmese Baptists, I'm not sure this would be a controversial issue. But what about Syrian Muslims or Afghans or others of different religious traditions? Some American Christians see that as something as a threat. Our view at World Relief is that's actually an incredible opportunity for the church, because we've been given this great commission to go and make disciples of all nations. And most of our churches have been very creative in how we send people to the nations, and we should do that. But we've missed something profound if we don't notice that God in his sovereignty has also brought the nations here, into this context where we are blessed with religious freedom, where we're free to share our faith, and people are free to receive that or to reject it. And to be really clear, at least at World Relief, we really love that idea of religious freedom. We want that for ourselves and we want that for others. We don't want to impose our faith on anyone. We don't want to coerce them or trick them into conversion. We don't do proselytism, which is when there's some element of pressure or coercion. But we don't think that that's the same as evangelism, which is an open invitation to a relationship with Jesus. And frankly, often that conversation is going to happen in response to a question. When it's a team from a local church that welcomes a family at the airport and loves them as their neighbors, which we'd be called to do whether they would ever share our faith or not. When we do that part well, it's rare that sooner or later there's not the question of why. Why do you love us so much? And we get to, as 1 Peter 3 says, to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is within you. So I'm going to wrap up in about 3 minutes. And actually, I'm going to have you pass these out, Lizzie, if you don't mind.
Sure.
But I just want to mention a few things you could do with all this, and I'll close with one more story. We'll see if it's really 3 minutes. So we've used this acronym of PLEASE. The first point there is prayer. Not just because LEASE wasn't a very good acronym, but we really believe that prayer should be the beginning and the middle and the end of any difficult issue. The L is listening. And I would say we should be listening first and foremost to the scriptures. And that's one of the handouts that Lizzie is passing out is a 40-verse Bible reading guide related to the theme of immigration. Intentionally, it's not going to tell you who to vote for or anything about immigration policy. You can make those decisions for yourself, but our hope is that Christians can start on the same page of how do we think about this as a biblical issue. It's on the YouVersion Bible app too, if you want to download it on your phone. The E in that acronym is empowering churches abroad. I mentioned it's a very small share of the world's refugees who are ever going to come to the United States. In fact, about 80% of the world's refugees are in a country neighboring the country that they fled, which includes some of the most under-resourced countries in the world. Last week I was with my colleague who leads World Relief's work in Burundi, which is amongst the poorest countries in the world. And we were comparing notes on how we're serving Congolese refugees. We were settling a small number into Aurora, Illinois, where I live, and they're carrying in a camp in Burundi for Congolese refugees. And we're doing so, just like we do in Aurora, Illinois, in close partnership with local churches that are leading the effort to help care for these people. So one way you can be involved is support the work the World Relief is doing beyond the United States and helping both care for refugees abroad, but also addressing the root causes that end up bubbling over into migration situations: poverty, conflict, marginalization. The A in that acronym is advocacy. One definition of advocacy is Proverbs 31, verse 8, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. I want to be careful how we use that passage because I just told you to listen to the scriptures. We should also certainly listen to immigrants who do have voices. But there is a reality where our lawmakers tend to be really concerned with the views of U.S. citizens who can vote, and sometimes a lot less concerned with the views of non-citizens, whether a newly arrived refugee or someone in a camp halfway around the world. And I view it actually as a unique stewardship opportunity to speak up, amplifying the voices of those whose voices maybe don't get heard, who are particularly vulnerable. One way we do that at World Relief is through a partnership with the Evangelical Migration Table. So that includes the National Association of Evangelicals, the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, and various other groups that have basically come together and said, these are some broad principles that we think ought to inform how our lawmakers look at immigration policy, driven by Scripture. And that's on the back of that response card. One thing that you could do to advocate even tonight is just check that box and say, yeah, I could put my name on this. That's very helpful to us when we go and meet with Senator Tillis or Senator Budd and say, you know, there are constituents in North Carolina who want you to pursue immigration policies in line with these principles. The S in that acronym is serving locally. You have unique opportunities to do so here through your church, through El Cuerpo. There's refugee resettlement happening through Church World Service here in Wilmington. There's a new private sponsorship called Welcome Corps that World Relief can help with anywhere in the country to help a refugee family come, if that'd be interest. So if you're interested in how do I get involved more locally, check that box as well, and I'll certainly share that with Lizzie and Socorro, but we can figure out how to help direct you to opportunities. And then the last piece is evangelism. As we advocate with people, as we serve them, as we love them as our neighbors, we have the opportunity to point people to the hope of the gospel. And those things go hand in hand, because our witness is much stronger when we have shown that we really believe what the Bible says about loving foreigners and loving our neighbors. I'll close with this idea, and it's on the idea of hospitality. Most of us think of hospitality as maybe it's like a committee at the church that makes coffee, or it's having like a really nice meal for your friends to come over, or like a nice guest room set up with clean sheets and towels when your in-laws come into town. Those are all really nice, good things to do. But I would argue that they actually miss the heart of hospitality, because hospitality in the Greek of the New Testament is the word philoxenia. It is the love of strangers, which is actually something of a countercultural idea. I grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons that had these public service announcements about stranger danger, right? Like strangers are scary people who we are taught could be a potential threat to us. And I'm not telling you that all strangers are safe, but the Bible does tell us really explicitly in Romans 12, in fact, elsewhere in the New Testament, it's a requirement for leadership in the church that we are to be hospitable, that we are to practice hospitality, that we are to practice loving strangers. And interestingly, we see throughout the scriptures, Old and New Testament, where people who have done so end up being blessed by God in the process. Someone like Boaz in the book of Ruth, he's not all that unique. He's just following the rules when he lets this foreigner woman go and glean in his fields. But by being faithful to that command, he ends up married to a lovely wife and part of the lineage of Jesus. You have this impoverished pagan woman in the book of 1 Kings when this Jewish prophet Elijah comes to her and said, hey, could you help feed me? And her response is, I would, but have you noticed that I'm on my last meal and about to die? But she still opens up her home to him. And by the power of God in his life, he'd fed, but so is she. And her son is ultimately healed. And the most beautiful thing in that story, it's subtle, but the beginning of the story, she talks to Elijah about your God. By the end of the story, she's talking about the God. That suggests a transformation spiritually as well. Or in the book of Acts, where Paul and those with him shipwreck on the island of Malta, and these islanders go to these great lengths to welcome them, and they end up being blessed in return. Or even back at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, where Abraham sees these strangers traveling at a distance, and he tells his wife, start the feast. There's strangers coming. We have to be ready to feed them. And of course, they end up being these divine messengers who have the news for him that God is about to fulfill a promise and make him a father. Well, it was some years ago, more than a decade ago now, there's a new family that moved into the apartment complex I was living in. My girlfriend came over, and she also lived in the same apartment complex, and told me about this family. They're from East Africa, mom, 8 months pregnant, and 3 children. And, they did not come as refugees. They came on tourist visas and were seeking asylum because of a political situation they were fleeing in their country of origin. And because they didn't come through the refugee resettlement process, World Relief didn't know they were coming. We didn't meet them at the airport with a team from a church. So this was sort of our first awareness that they were here. And they had basically nothing. This mom was 8 months pregnant, didn't know where the hospital was. So we said, hey, we want to practice hospitality. How could we help? We put up a message on Facebook and said, could we find some furniture to put in their basically empty apartment? And my girlfriend Diana was there at the airport when that baby was born a month later. In time, they won their asylum claim, which was a huge answer to prayer, which meant they could get jobs and they could pay their own rent. And their son was baptized at our church. The whole family was already Christians when they arrived, really strong Christians who relied on their faith in Jesus through some really awful circumstances. Anyway, in time, they didn't really need our help anymore. They were just our friends. And that's actually what we want to see at World Relief. Up front, there's a lot of needs, but long term, we want it to be a reciprocal relationship. Well, some more time went by. Diana and I got married. They were part of our wedding. Some more time went by, and their husband/father showed up. And it's a long story why he wasn't there in the first place. It relates to the persecution that they were fleeing from. But I was there at the baggage claim when he met his 2-year-old son for the first time. And they were holding it together decently well. I was just a weepy mess. People were worried about me. What's wrong with this guy? But it was powerful to see him meet his 2-year-old daughter and to see his other children and to embrace his wife after several years of absence and really uncertainty if they would ever see each other again. In time, he became a really close friend as well, and really they became mentors to Diana and me in marriage. They'd been married a lot longer than we had been. Well, one point, this is probably about a year after we got married, they were over at our house for dinner, and they said, so, you guys have been married for a year, when are you going to have kids? Which is not really culturally appropriate to ask, but we'll forgive that because they're not from here. And we told them, we would love to have kids. We've been hoping and praying to have kids basically since we got married, and it hasn't happened, and so you could pray for us, which is kind of a nice casual Christian thing to say. And my friend John Vier said, I just have this sense from the Lord that he's going to bless you with a child in the next year. Well, I didn't start painting a nursery, but I appreciated that. But it's not that I hadn't tried prayer. Well, it was only a few months, probably 4 or 5 months later, this time we were over at their house for dinner, and we got to share the news with them that Diana was pregnant. And they were the first people we told before our parents or anyone else, kind of before you're supposed to tell people you're pregnant. But we were so excited, and we knew that they'd been praying for us. And there was a little bit of a delay as they're in their own minds translating our English into their own language in their head. But you could see when they understood what we had just communicated, because they fell down on the ground in their kitchen, prostrate on the ground, shouting all sorts of Jesus and Hallelujahs. I don't know exactly what they were saying, but it was like a Pentecostal church service in their kitchen. And they went on to tell us that they'd been getting up early every Thursday for months. That they had been fasting all day on Thursdays for months and praying that God would bless us with a child. And that's my daughter Zipporah on her first birthday. The 10-year-old version is in the kids ministry now. But she is, I have no doubt, the answer to their prayers. And to ours, but mostly to theirs because I didn't fast and pray all days on Thursdays. Also, we now have 4 children, and I would like them to stop praying. But I want to close with that challenge to practice hospitality, practice loving strangers, and don't be surprised if a few of them turn out to be angels in disguise. So I saved less time than I meant to, but we have at least a few minutes for Q&A. If people have questions, I'll just repeat the question into the mic because I think we are recording this. Yes?
How did this become a personal interest of yours and feel God's call to this work?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you for that. So the question was how this became a personal call for me. I grew up in Wisconsin in a place where we didn't really have immigrants. I'm sure we did, but I didn't know any of them. There was a British kid in my elementary school, and we all thought that was very exotic. But this was just not something I thought about, except for maybe as a political issue I heard on television. And then I went to the Chicagoland area, to Wheaton College for undergrad. And I think the first time it really caught my attention is that I had a classmate who was born in Mexico, and I didn't think that much of that. But we became pretty good friends. At one point, she shared with me that she was what we sometimes call a dreamer. She was brought here as a 4 or 5-year-old with no legal status, and had managed to get she's not eligible for any sort of federal financial aid, but had gotten a private scholarship to go to Wheaton College. And she ended up getting her legal status her senior year through a petition filed by her uncle for her mother like 25 years earlier. And it happened within a few days of her 21st birthday, which was just, God's providence in that case. But I remember hearing that story and I didn't have a category for that. I didn't even know what she was telling me. It wasn't something I'd ever encountered before. But then I went and spent some time in Costa Rica, where I was actually ministering in just a volunteer missions role with mostly Nicaraguan immigrants in Costa Rica. And there's a ton of Nicaraguan immigrants in Costa Rica. I think sometimes as Americans we think that immigrants all come here. Well, Costa Rica has far more immigrants per capita than the United States of America does, because it's just an incredible number of Nicaraguans, now Venezuelans as well, who've gone to Costa Rica over the years. It's when you have a poor country that's politically unstable next to a richer country that's quite stable. And I heard a lot of really ugly things about the Nicaraguans from my Costa Rican friends. All the bad words I learned in Spanish, they don't teach you in high school, but I learned them on the buses and the graffiti and the San Jose buses right next to the word Nica. And it really upset me because I was spending my days with these Nicaraguan families, and they weren't perfect people, but they weren't uniquely bad people. They were working incredibly hard and often under really hard circumstances in what was basically a slum. And I remember asking one of my Nicaraguan friends, well, why would you come here? And get treated so badly. And they said, Mateo, here we've got a little bit of food on our plate, a little bit of extra money left over to support our elderly parents in Nicaragua, and that's all we could ask for. And that really stuck with me. I went back to the Chicagoland area and realized, kind of self-righteously, wow, that's terrible that they said those things about those Nicaraguans. And I realized, I think that I maybe have heard those things about Mexicans in the United States, but I don't actually know any of them. And maybe they're not completely true either. And around the same time, I ended up going back to Nicaragua with World Relief, interned there for 6 months, which gave me a little bit of more perspective on why people had been leaving Nicaragua. I also then started at World Relief, not because I knew that I wanted to work with immigrants my whole life, but I loved World Relief's mission of empowering churches to serve the vulnerable in Nicaragua, and they had an office in Wheaton, Illinois. So I ended up getting acquainted with immigration law. And one of the first things you understand when you work with U.S. immigration law is it's really actually kind of dumb. It's not only is it hard for immigrants and not in their interest, it's also not in the interest of our national security or our national economy. It was a decent set of laws in 1965 when they wrote it, and just so much has changed that it is woefully out of date. But it hasn't been significantly updated. A little bit in 1990, a little bit in 1996, but in terms of a broad reform, it's been decades. And that made me wonder why that is. And that's kind of shifted me from direct legal services to more of the policy work that is a big part of my job today. Maybe one more question? Yeah.
How do churches get involved in refugee settlement?
Wonderful question. So there's really 2 ways to do that. One is to find a refugee resettlement agency. And in your community here in Wilmington, that's Church World Service. So I know they were actually at the last event that Lizzie was, and I was before. They're new, and they've just started resettlement in the last year or 2 here in Wilmington. So it's a relatively new thing, if I'm not mistaken. So I would reach out to them. That would be one option, and say, hey, how could our church be involved? Another option, and this is an even more new dynamic, there's something called the Welcome Corps, where a church can actually say, hey, we want to put together a team that is going to care for a specific refugee family, coming up with some of the finances involved in covering their rent and some other expenses for the first several months they're here. World Relief can help coach you on that, sort of remotely. We have a staff person who's actually in the Charlotte area who is at a national level helping support churches go through that sponsorship process. And we would love to help more churches with that process as well. One unique thing about that is they're telling us that by 2024, the sponsoring group, which is often going to be a church, could actually name the specific refugee to come. So it would be an opportunity if your church has a missionary in somewhere and they are trying to help a specific family, who probably doesn't have any access to the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, they do need to prove they're a refugee. They need to be outside of their country of origin with a well-founded fear of persecution for one of the reasons under the law. But it would up their odds of being selected from less than 0.5% to much more likely if they had a church sponsor in the United States. So if you go to worldrelief.org, it should be pretty prominent on our website, the Welcome Core, where we can help people with that. You tell me if I need to dismiss people. I'll just keep going.
We'll let him go.
Okay.
I think and you've tried to address it, but just from a just common person's perspective, they're watching the news, 2 million people cross the border, they're frustrated by that. They don't feel like they have any agency, maybe voting, in 2024 or something, but even still, it doesn't seem to matter too much.
Yeah.
And you have that stream of frustration connected to the stream of mercy and grace and generosity you have in the church. And trying to push those two together without them causing your own internal conflict.
Yeah.
Or internal conflict in a church where you're saying, well, I mean, we can't help that, we can help this.
Yeah.
And you've tried to talk about it, but I'm trying to get another answer or the same answer, just because those are the conversations I end up with.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I'd say a few things on that. One is, the dynamics of the border are complicated. Again, I was just there, and I'm there on a fairly regular basis. One thing that's important to know is it's true that 2 million people are encountered at the border. It's not true that they're all in the United States. A large number are, but also last year about half were sent back. So it's not at all that everyone is being allowed in. Nor is it random. What's happening is people are seeking asylum in unprecedented numbers. They are not trying to evade the Border Patrol, sneak past the Border Patrol. They're crossing the border, which in Texas at least is the river, where you put your hands out, the wall is 20 feet ahead of you. You're south of the wall where it exists, but you're already on U.S. property and you have the right to seek asylum. Now, some of those people will be deported quickly because it's determined you don't have any case for asylum. But the thing that's changed in the last few years is we have more people coming from places that actually often win their asylum claims, Venezuela in particular. Venezuela it's a disaster, and it's a mix of economic disaster caused by a terrible government and real persecution from an authoritarian, socialist regime that will absolutely persecute their political opponents. And a significant share of Venezuelans win their cases, but also lots of them lose their cases because what they're fleeing is actually desperate poverty. So there's a few things to know about that. One is, we shouldn't be afraid of the dynamics of the border as if these were people sneaking in and they're, going to land in your community and they're here to harm you. The people who are getting in the vast majority of cases, are people who've been at least background checked. There's no reason to think they're a safety threat or they're not allowed in. And they're given a court date. The problem is that court date in some cases is, several years into the future. The average time to finish an asylum court is 4 years. So some people are faster than that, some are longer. And that's bad both for the people who really qualify and for the people who really don't qualify, because it gives them the incentive to come even if you have a marginal case. And again, in my experience, it's not so much fraud as people have no idea what the rules are, which is not a dig on them because most Americans don't have any idea what the rules are either. Our rules are incredibly complicated and they change. I think the policy solutions on that, first of all, the ministry solutions is, be kind to the people in your neighborhood, regardless of what you think their legal status is. Help their kids with their homework, which I know this church does. Help them try to navigate life in a new place. But I think it is worth zooming out and saying, what are the policy solutions? The irony to me is the policy solutions are going to address the border dynamics and some of the compassion dynamics, because that's the only set of policies that you could put together that could actually pass. Right now we have divided government. One party controls one chamber of Congress, the other party controls the other. You're going to need to address some of both of their interests to get a bill that could actually pass. I mentioned this bill, the Dignity Act. It's $35 billion for border security. That is not an insignificant amount of money. And it's $25 billion between ports of entry, $10 billion at ports of entry, which again is where actually the drugs are coming in. So it's addressing both those issues. It would reform the asylum process to say we're not going to release people in the United States for 4 years anymore. We're going to develop humanitarian campuses on the border where people would be held not in jails, not in detention, we want to treat people humanely. Again, some of these are persecuted Christians fleeing for their faith. But they would stay there while we give them access to legal counsel, but let them pursue their asylum claim there. And only in rare cases that would require more time would they be released into the U.S. with a court date. Most of the time you could determine that by ramping up. There's a lot of push to ramp up the number of Border Patrol agents. I'd be for that. But the biggest thing you could do would be to ramp up the number of immigration judges to adjudicate asylum claims in a more timely way. And that's one of the things the bill would do. At the same time, it would also let dreamers who've been here, for many years, who were brought as children, pursue citizenship in the United States. It would have a process for other immigrants who've been here for a number of years who would pay that fine the chance to earn legal status. And that's part of how it would actually pass. You get Democrats who will vote for it for some of those provisions, even if they don't love every other, and you get Republicans who really like certain other provisions but could tolerate it. It's not every member of Congress who's willing to do that sort of bipartisan negotiation, but it's really helpful when they hear from their constituents that they want that sort of solution. We want secure borders that are also humane. We want due process for asylum seekers. We don't want to just send people away without a process to determine if they could be fleeing a credible fear of persecution, because a significant, probably minority of them are. And even those who are fleeing economic hardship, again, what if we had more work-based visas where you didn't have to get to the border but could go to your consulate in your country of origin and say, hey, I want to pick crops in North Carolina, and it turns out the agricultural industry in North Carolina is desperate for more of those people. That seems like a win-win. And I think that there's ways to put those pieces together. But for the church, I care about the policies, obviously. I spend my day thinking about that. I think if we could get the church to start at, let's think about this as Christians, as a biblical issue, and be kind to the immigrants who come into our community and see them as people whom Jesus loved and died for, that would be a great place to start. And the policy issues in some ways will come naturally. Once you hear some stories of how dysfunctional the process is, people become advocates for some changes to policy. I think I should give you the mic back. Thank you, Lizzie.
I'm going to just say a quick prayer. Thank you, Matt, for your time. And he can stick around for a few minutes if you have any further questions. But if y'all pray with me. Lord, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for this evening, for Matt traveling so far to share his passion and the passion of world relief with us. Father, we pray that we would have eyes to see just your will, your way, and that we would just keep our eyes on the Bible and be reminded of your word, that you do call us to love our neighbors. And we pray, Lord, that we would do that tangibly in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and just be your hands and feet. Thank you, Father. Amen.